So 2 years ago, we gave a presentation where we introduced the fact that a number of African American students, and to this point that we could discover they were all men, had come to Ferris from Hampton, which today Hampton University is a huge university, and a university in every sense of the term. But in those days, it was more of a technical school. And although Ferris was something of a technical school, it also had college prep. It had a college prep program. And so those students came up here. So we gave that presentation. And so we're here today to update you. We have a draft of a book.
Yay.
This is the, yes. Yay. So that's good. But had we published a book 2 years ago, I'll speak for Franklin here. I won't do it much today. We would be embarrassed by how much stuff we wouldn't have had
Correct.
in there.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So we've learned a lot, and we'd like to tell you some of the things we've learned.
I'm Franklin Hughes, by the way, as you referred to. One thing I want to say is that if you didn't get a MLK button, they have them outside there. So get one, and they'll be passing them out before the march. So stay around and do the march afterwards, starting at 4 o'clock. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the story. So one of the things that the first things that we learned in this story, which is something that was known, but in the Ferris catalog, the Ferris Institute had international students here prior to 1900. So the school started in 1884, and by 1903 it was in the catalog, and it said 10 years, or last 10 years, so that would be in the 1890s. You had students from Norway, Sweden, Germany, Armenia, Mexico, and actually Ferris had probably one of the first ESL programs, English as a Second Language programs, in the early 1900s. So international culture and embracing other cultures has always been a part of the fabric of the institution at Ferris.
Okay. I would like to read this quote. This is a quote. When you travel around Ferris, you see a lot of quotes. It's not that I don't like those quotes, but I have to tell you, after some of the stuff we've seen, those old quotes don't have the same freshness, if that makes sense. So here's one. And by the way, we were looking for a name of the book. And if you ever write a history book, it's impossible to find a name for a history book because there's too many history books that have been written and they've used up all the good names. So a great name for ours would have been Hidden Figures. But I'd be darned, someone took that name. And so we were reading some black spirituals, and there was a line in one talking about a haste to rise. Now, keep in mind, that's before we found this quote from Woodridge. And it says, in order to, oh, by the way, you hear a lot of talk about Woodridge Ferris's speech, Make the World Better. No one has ever seen a complete text of that speech because it likely does not exist. He had notes. He had big points he'd like to make, and then he'd sort of tailor it from place to place. But in all the instances, there were some themes that jumped out, like don't be selfish, help other people, okay? So here's a quote that we found from the Courier, Waterloo, Iowa, 1910. In order to make the world better, we must first make ourselves better. We must curb selfishness, and the best way to do that is to start on ourselves right in our homes. Selfishness gets its first hold on us in our homes. Consequently, that is the place to begin uprooting it. The man who is very selfish and who at the same time has a sharp intellect is a very dangerous man. It is not the ignorant man who is to be feared, but the sharp, selfish one who has no righteous principles. Get all the knowledge you can get, but use your knowledge in the right way, and it will be of untold benefit to you. Don't use it in oppressing others. And then here's the part that gave us chills because we had already decided on this name, Haste to Rise. And when you see a man or a woman trying to rise and doing the right thing, don't be selfish, but try to help that person rise. And that's the basis of that speech that he gave probably for 3 or 4 decades, actually more than that, for about 5 decades, which was making the world better. Go ahead.
We started looking into more and more instances of Mr. Ferris's character and how he tried to share his values with the student body. And one of the things that was known about Mr. Ferris is that they would have the morning exercises where he would read an encouraging word to the student body, an uplifting thing, or something to challenge them. And in 1903, we discovered that he read from the souls of black folk. And Dr. Pilgrim can probably talk a little bit more about the importance of that book. But this was about 7 years or so prior to before GideonSmith attended Ferris, which at that time we had thought was the first African American. So, but Mr. Ferris was reading from black scholars and giving the black voice to his student body and cultivating that attitude in the culture here.
Here's an interesting thing. We got to a point where we were trying to decide, should we refer to Booker T. Washington as Woodridge's friend or not? He just mentioned, Franklin just talked about W.B. Du Bois. And of course, in 1903, that was a radical book. And by the way, it criticized Booker T. Washington in that book. If you read, we actually found a quote later where he talks about how his respect for both men. But as regards, and I think there's some reasons for that. With W.B. Du Bois, Woodridge liked the fact that he was saying that African Americans, even poor ones, should be given an opportunity for, quote, higher education. And we have this great quote where he talks about the value of poetry, the value of literature and a lot, like not just working on a farm. But in the case of Booker T. Washington, Franklin, I think there was a deeper connection. And so one of the things is this: we know they spoke together at the same conferences. We know when Booker T. Washington died in 1915, there was a eulogy held for him in Detroit. Woodridge gave a memorial held for him. Woodridge gave the eulogy. We know when Booker T. Washington died that when everybody else in the country was referring to him as that Negro educator or whatever, Woodridge simply said of him, he was a prince among educators. That the respect that he had for him. So we know they spent time together. Again, I don't know what friendship is. I mean, well, you think we're friends?
Yes.
So you don't know what friendship is either then. So yeah, we're friends. So my point though is they spent lots of time together and he had a great deal of admiration for Booker T. Washington. And we know that Booker T. Washington came here.
Yes.
And we actually owe that. Most of the stuff we found. But this one we actually owe to Fran, who found, what did she find in a Pioneer?
She found it in a Pioneer. She was looking for some information on Nathan Harris, a guy we'll talk about here in a minute. And she found that Booker T. Washington did come to speak here at Ferris Institute in 1902 to a sold-out crowd. And he was greeted with cheers and lauds. They loved him, and people came from all over the area to hear him speak.
And that was the year after Booker T. Washington had been involved in a national scandal because he dared to eat in the White House.
It was about 6 months afterwards.
About 6 months late, it was 6 months afterwards. And it was a national scandal because it promoted social equality, that the President of the United States had allowed a Negro to eat in the White House. There were people talking about killing him. 6 months later, he's speaking at Ferris.
I tell you, it's 9 months, but yeah.
Make up your mind, my friend.
But the thing is...
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Roosevelt, yes. Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt.
But one of the patterns, though, that we've actually noticed with Mr. Ferris is that even though society was doing certain things, he almost every time made a statement that was contrary to society. While most of the politicians and the school leaders would have rejected Booker T. Washington, he embraced him. And we found other instances of that before when the military was segregated, we had integrated ROTC units here at Ferris. So it was almost like he was putting it in their face, saying, we're not going to be this way. We're going to be a different institution.
Well, and the one thing we did not find, which was apparently a copy of Booker T. Washington's biography that Woodridge donated to Ferris with his handwritten notes in the margins that either got burned up or lost or something, and we just, that would be a treasure if we were to find that.
Definitely. Oops. So our our looks continue to try to find, all right, so then who was the first African-American to attend Ferris Institute? Last time we did the presentation, I think we had Nate Harris.
Yeah.
But after that, we discovered this guy, Middleton E Pickens. And so he was an interesting man. And again, we don't really know why he chose Ferris. He came here in 1900, and we're still trying to figure out how he even heard about Ferris. But we know Mr. Ferris did travel a lot, and he
advertised in newspapers.
Advertised everywhere. So Middleton Pickens is an interesting life. He went to Lincoln University. He received 2 degrees prior to coming to Ferris. When he came here in 1900, he enrolled in the pharmacy program. And one of the interesting things about when he was here is he was the editor of the pharmacy department in the Ferris Institute News. So he wrote articles about the happenings on campus of the pharmac students. And I would really challenge anyone to find an African American at a predominantly white institution who was an editor, one of the editors at a newspaper, at their school newspaper in 1900. So this is a radical thing where he wasn't just here, he was a part of the community. And so, and then the more we find about Mr. Pickens, in 1904, after he left Ferris, he went to the Detroit College of Medicine. He headed up the Colored Voters Independent Club, which at that time, Mr. Ferris was a Democrat. And so this would be rare for African Americans to start clubs to support a Democrat.
Because they were, African Americans were all Republicans.
Yeah, for the most part. Yep. And so he later, after he practiced medicine, he was a doctor in, was in Detroit for a few years. He moved to Muskogee, Oklahoma. One of the coolest things about him is this last point here. He died in 1915, Pickens did. But we discovered in the probate records that Mr. Ferris had made him personal loans to go to the Detroit College of Medicine, which is about $800, but today is over $19,000. And at that time, Mr. Ferris was not a rich man.
Right.
I mean, the school was still relatively new, but here you have Mr. Ferris demonstrating, not just in word, but in action, that he's going to help someone rise. He's going to give them this opportunity. And he wasn't the only one, the only student that he provided loans to. It's known that he had a safe in his house where he had all these notes, these IOU kind of notes or whatever from his students, and he would brag on it that most of his students always paid him back. But his whole thing, and him and his wife, was we're going to help people make it.
Yeah. So I don't know if the next slide has the quote. Yes. So, because we did this a while back and I couldn't remember. So here's a black doctor in Muskogee, Oklahoma in the early 1900s. And by the way, he's the answer to the question today, who was the first African-American student at Ferris? 2 years from now, we're going to tell you it was somebody else. But for right now, and I'll have to give Franklin credit because he's so competitive, I had found the one just before this. And so now Franklin had to go find somebody before that because that's the person that he is. This is in the early 1900s. This is an obituary. And look at how beautiful this is in this, what at the time would have been a relatively small city. And that, okay, I want to skip down to this. That death loves a shining star was forcibly brought to attention of the minds and hearts of many Muskogeans last Thursday by the unexpected taking off of that well-known and popular Negro physician, Dr. M.E. Pickens, just as he was passing such and such and such. It would be difficult for one to name a man professionally engaged as he was more widely admired and beloved. And this is because his medical attainments were above question and criticism, and also that he was a man of proverbial generous and good nature. You don't have to study a lot of history to understand that was uncommon to have a white newspaper write that about any black person in 1915 or 1916, okay? And he is the person we believe is the first. He's certainly the first that we found. Next.
So after him, and so Middleton Pickens was here in 1900, and then we have Booker T. Washington coming here in 1902 to speak. But also in the year 1902, we found this man, Nate Harris. So Nate Harris played baseball. He was a professional baseball player for the Negro League, actually quite a few teams. And it wasn't an organized Negro Leagues at that time. There was multiple teams. They're kind of barnstorming teams. But in 1902, in 1902, the team came up here to play a few games in the summer. The local community loved them so much, loved the whole team, this all-black team, that they pulled monies together to secure the Chicago Union Giants to finish their season, to play the rest of the season here at the Ferris, or here in Big Rapids. And they were renamed the Big Rapids Colored Giants. At first, it was an integrated team. You had some of because there was a Big Rapids Giants team, and they kind of mixed, but then after, a week or so, they just became the Big Rapids Colored Giants.
Well, Frank, I just want to say this. Do you realize what he's saying? In 1902, this all-black team from Chicago, which was one of the best baseball teams, black or white, in the United States, relocated where? To Big Rapids. Merged with the local white team. Then eventually, if whatever happened, most of the whites, if not all, left. That black team then became the what do they call the Big Rapids Giants, and played for what was billed as the what?
The World Championship.
The colored championship of the world was played in Big Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah, a series.
Don't just look at this as a PowerPoint and just read as words. Think about what that's saying. All right, Go ahead. Sorry, Franklin.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Appreciate the enthusiasm.
I'm all pumped up because I didn't go to sleep
it's all
last
good.
night. Yeah.
So, so they played here, and more than that, there was a lot of, if you look at the histories now of Negro League baseball stars that are in the Hall of Fame, almost every single one of those early ones played here in Big Rapids during that year and during that time. Rube Foster being one of them. But Nate Harris was the star of the game. But after the season, Nate Harris stayed here in Big Rapids, and he attended the Ferris Institute, where he coached the football team and played on the football team, which wouldn't be something that was rare back then because football teams were kind of strange. The team would play some high school type teams, some local adult teams, and then some college teams. So they did a lot. 1902 was a great year. They won, the championship of Northern and Western Michigan football outside of the college teams. That's how the newspaper billed it, that Ferris won the championship. The next year, they tried to up their competition, and they played the University of Michigan in one of their games and got destroyed 88-0. And actually, that pretty much ended Nate Harris's football career because he was carted off the field injured. Now, one of the interesting things, and Dr. Pilgrim, you can talk about this, University of Michigan was coached by Fielding Yost, who was a staunch segregationist and a racist. And so it wouldn't be surprising if Nate Harris was the target of injury for that game, because he was a star of the team, and you have this coach who wants to make an example out of him. And so.
Well, and also, let's keep in mind, one of the things people asked us last time, well, what is it you want to see happen? Well, there are a lot of things we want to see happen. One of the things we want to propose at some point is that Nate Harris be elected to the Ferris Sports Hall of Fame. All right? He is listed in all the things that do the Negro League stuff. He's always listed as like the second or third best second baseman in all those leagues. He played here at Ferris. Yes. And he coached the football team. So that's, I don't know what the Hall of Fame means, but I mean, Pittsburgh Courier listed him as one of the all-time great black ball players. All right.
Yeah, and so after football ended for him, he went back to playing baseball, and he was actually one of the organizers, the first organizers with Rube Foster when the Negro Leagues became the National Negro Baseball Leagues, where there was organized schedules and they all played together. Yeah. He coached a number of the teams during those periods in the 20s and 30s. Mm-hmm. This is Nate Harris, and this is a picture of the 1909 Leland Giants.
Yeah, and that's the team that came here, right?
Yes.
No, 19.
Well,
not the exact
this
composition.
one, but some of those players were here on the team in 1901 or 1902 as well.
So we'll probably use that picture. We'll violate somebody's copyright. So
the next student we found was Chester Bush, who was here from 1903 to 1905 in the commercial department, which would be the business department, I believe. He would go on to manage editor of the Mosaic Guide, the first publication of the Mosaic Templars of America. Now, the Mosaic Templars of America was an organization started by John E. Bush, which, I can't remember who the other guy was, but John Bush and Keats. John Keats started the Mosaic Templars of America. Now, they provided insurance, burial benefits to African Americans when no one else would. And in John Bush's life, he was probably one of the wealthiest African American men in all of the country. and it was a very successful business venture that he was involved in. And he was actually a close friend with Booker T. Washington and a part of Booker T. Washington's cabinet and everything. So that's significant that you have this very prominent African-American man is going to send his son here to Ferris Institute in 1903 to get an education, which at the time, or after that, Chester took off and ended up running the Mosaic Templars Association after his father died and started the NAACP, the first NAACP in Little Rock, Arkansas.
And you know, that's the chapter of the NAACP that's going to become famous in the 1950s.
For what? Ask the
great.
quiz. For what?
Well, I don't want to embarrass anybody.
But we had a present.
The other thing is that Templars, there's a group affiliated with them that is renting out one of our Jim Crow Museum traveling exhibits. And so we may use that as an opportunity to go down and try to fill out some of our records. Okay.
So there's Chester Bush here at the bottom.
The governor, what was his name? Faustus? Tried to block
Orville-
9 children from
Orville
going.
Faustus.
Yes, tried to block 9 children from entering the school, and the National Guard had to be brought out.
Little
And
Rock
NAACP led the effort to get them in. Yeah.
So there's Chester here at the bottom, and here's John Bush, his father, and C.W. Keats, who also started the Mosaic Templars of America. Oops. The next guy we found, and actually this is your guy, so you can go ahead and talk about him.
Yeah, so Edward.
Who's not first, by the way.
Yeah. Edward McDaniel Jr. was also a friend of Booker T. Washington. Oh, well, the senior was a friend of Booker T. Washington. And this is the interesting thing. Those of you, are any of you history students? So here's the deal. We've tried to be very meticulous and all, but sometimes you find it on I don't want to say luck because I don't believe in luck, but in a more random way. This is what I mean. I was just interested in the trains that were used to transport mail, because some of them were just a car that was a train car that was attached to a regular passenger train. They were inherently almost always unsafe, but they were high status jobs, so to speak. And so they would pile in like 8 or 12 of these people to sort mail. This was like a high position, to sort mail. And one of them, I discovered, was a black guy. And I was like, well, that's pretty cool. I mean, I didn't know at the time Ferris had that as a major. Okay? I still haven't made the connection that he came here, whatever, but we had that as an actual major. Remember, because Mr. Ferris was, let us say, flexible when it came to creating majors, right? So anyway, I was reading an article, and I found that a black guy had this job. Not even thinking about this project. I like reading old newspapers. And the car pulled away, broke away, and he almost died. There was, and the newspaper said there were 2 injuries, 1 serious, a Negro. And it said Edgar E. McDaniel Sr.
It said he may not survive.
He may not survive.
And that's all it said.
And so, well, that's serious. So,
but there's no follow-up.
But there's no follow-up, yeah. So I just kept trying to figure out, like, what happened to this guy? This has nothing to do with our research. Well, I keep reading about him, and then finally I read the Topeka plain dealer, not plains dealer, plain dealer, and there's a story about him as he's older, and it mentions in the story that he had a son who went to Ferris Institute. And I'm like, what the world? This is like the forces of the universe here, right? And so then we trace and we find out, we believe him now. Well, he's certainly the fourth in terms of chronology, the one that we found. What I find interesting about him is, you know Madam C.J. Walker. She's reputed to be the first African-American millionaire, certainly African-American woman millionaire. And she had competition. She actually learned her trade studying under Annie Malone. And we had in the Jim Crow Museum a brochure from the Poirot College, which was really just a beauty school, African Americans to lighten their skin, straighten their hair, and that kind of stuff, which went for beauty in those days, right? And Madam C.J. Walker studied under her for a year and then went and got her own business to compete and superseded her in some ways. But what we didn't know is that the Poirot College, which became its own big venture, was managed by Edgar E. McDaniel, the Ferris graduate.
And it wasn't just an office manager. I mean,
Right.
he was basically, he ran the
He
business.
ran it.
He ran the business. So she
Yeah.
was the face, but he would be the business manager who ran the entire business.
Yeah. So the other thing to note, which we haven't kind of sorted through this yet, a lot of these early folks, like Arkansas and Oklahoma, they end up, either from there or locating out there somewhere. I don't know. Go ahead.
So here's a picture of him. This is the best picture we could find. Some of the things about the guys from the before 1907, they weren't in the yearbooks, and so we don't know if we have any pictures of them yet here at Ferris. But here he is up top. Here's Andy Malone, right here. I believe that's her.
Yeah.
So as we kept going, even early on when we were looking for pictures of GideonSmith or information about GideonSmith, we noticed this photo. And this photo's been around Ferris quite a bit. But there's this gentleman up here. I can't really point to him. And that's Frank Roberts. And so he was here the same time as GideonSmith. So even if we had thought that GideonSmith was the first African-American student here in 1910, that was definitely wrong because Frank Roberts was here at the same time. So they would have been here together. So here you have Frank Roberts, who was probably one of the first Michigan African-American students here at Ferris. And he was from St. Joseph. And after his time here at Ferris, he did a pharmacy in Detroit on, Beobon Street in Detroit for 35 years.
Oh. Yes. Yeah.
So I'm assuming Mr. Ferris in the middle, Garrett Maslink on the left. Do you think that's pharmacy faculty, pharmacy dean there on the right?
Yeah, I don't know if that.
Is that
I don't
the
think
guy
that's
we
Master.
found, that St. Peter guy, or that Peter guy?
I'm not sure who those guys are. I haven't looked at that.
Yeah. Well, the one is Maslink. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. It would seem to make sense. Yeah. Yeah. So this we've already said, and again, we just don't know how many. We were dependent on the yearbooks, and the yearbook, you just can't. Franklin did a really good job when he got himself and then me dragged into the rabbit hole of the Southern Workman, because everything's a snippet in there, and they give you a little bit of information and another little bit of information, and you go running someplace else. So we were actually having a discussion the other day, because we got like a whole list of people. What's our best estimate of how many were here? And what's your best estimate?
I'll say about 50.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
From Hampton.
Yeah, from Hampton, yeah, yeah. That's what I would say, about 50 of them. There was a heyday. There's a wonderful picture at Ferris. We found it on the floor over in archives, or up against the wall, whatever. It was a 1920 picture. And 1920s is like kind of the heyday of the thing. So, go ahead.
Yeah, so mainly what our book is about is going to be primarily about the Hampton students, because we felt this was the largest and the biggest connection that Mr. Ferris had with a single entity, because it was almost like a pipeline. A lot of these students came up from Hampton to come here. So the next part, we'll start focusing on some of these guys and what we found out about them and their stories.
Yeah. So we'll go a little bit faster because we want to get you through. Those people we showed you before this, some of that was brand new, and so we wanted to get you that. By the way, Diane, she did that picture over there, and you've seen the picture she did of the 6 Hampton people around campus. So that's GideonSmith. He learned to play football here. He could have played football at Hampton, but he learned to play football here. He then went to Michigan State University, which was called Michigan Agricultural College. He got there in 1913. The coach didn't want him on the team because he was black. He wouldn't give him equipment. He borrowed equipment from a friend of a friend, went out on the field and impressed the coach. So he put him on the JV. The next year, and by the way, he played against that team while he was at Ferris. Right. And so they had a chance to see him then. And then he goes there. In 1913, he becomes one of the outstanding football players in America and becomes the first black varsity athlete at the university, at Michigan State, of what became Michigan State. Again, now we've honored him with I think we gave him an Alumni of the Year or something award. But GideonSmith is another guy not in the Ferris Football Hall of Fame.
And he was a star. I mean, he wasn't.
He was a star.
He was an absolute star in football. The position he played was tackle, and so nowadays you think of tackle just blocks, but it was Iron Man football, so you play both. You play offense and defense. But as a tackle on offense as well, he would run the ball on tackle arounds, and he was consistently the most dominant player on the field. All his time here at Ferris and all his time at the Michigan Agricultural College, where he would dominate all-pro, all-American men each week.
Yeah, he dominated people that are in the Hall of Fame.
Yes, and another good thing, interesting thing about GideonSmith is that he was the last African-American to play professional football before it was what de facto segregation, where
Right.
African-Americans were not allowed to play until, what was it, Marion Motley in the 50s,
Yeah.
I believe it was?
Yeah.
So he was the last one. He played in a game with Jim Thorpe. And if you know Jim Thorpe, he was the famed Native American or greatest athlete of all time, some people would say.
Yeah.
He played with him in a game.
Against Newt Rockne.
Yes.
Yep. So also he became a great coach. And so a lot of what we read about him was, so here's the thing about history. We found GideonSmith under like 5 different names. Mm-hmm. Even Woodridge wrote him a letter for all the world to see because he wanted to celebrate him. He wanted to tell him how proud he was. So he wrote this letter and had it published all across, it was in newspapers all across the country. And he calls him what, George? I think he called him George or something. Oh, you don't see that part in there. All right. He was called Gid, he was called G.E. He even a couple times played under a fake name.
He was called Charlie.
Charlie Smith. And I tell you, Woodridge is in my first team All-Americans. Woodridge Ferris, first team All-American, along with Fannie Lou Hamer and people like that, okay? So Gideon played in a choir. I think he played a clarinet.
He did.
Okay? And in 1915, when he's finishing, and he's celebrated now, okay? Woodridge comes to a church where Gideon is in the choir, and he hears him play. And Woodridge came to a game in 1913, was the first time Michigan State had ever beat Michigan in football. They beat him 2 of the 3 years that Gideon was there, and he was credited with being largely responsible for those victories. But he came to hear him play in a black church, a Methodist, an AME church. That's Woodridge Ferris, okay?
One of the next guys that we have that we're going to highlight, that we highlight in the book, is Percival Pradas. And here again is a painting by Diane. And then here's a picture of him at Ferris in the debate club in 1917. So Pradas is interesting. He attended Hampton early on, then he came here to Ferris in 1916 and 1917, and after that he went to the military, where he was in World War I, and he became a battalion sergeant, sergeant major. So he was promoted, and he was probably one of the first, we'll get into that later. Nevertheless, when he came, after the war, he came back to Grand Rapids, where he and a guy named George Smith started the Michigan State News, which was the first African-American newspaper in Grand Rapids. And it was also pretty much the voice of the NAACP in Grand Rapids. Yeah. And so he started that newspaper with him. He worked at the Pantland.
Yeah, I was literally there this morning. Oh. I saw the sign. It said Pantland Hotel right in the Amway. And I thought, Percival Pradas. Oh, good. Yeah. Good. So he left there, they had a racial incident. And I'm not even going to tell you this racial stuff Gideon put up with. I mean, that's a long story, but he couldn't stay with the team. This is not down south. This is in Michigan. Couldn't stay with the team when they went to play other places. They had to sneak him in a hotel, or he didn't stay in the hotel at all. The coach would give him a little money for lunch or something. And I forget the All-American who he played with. He was a what's his name?
Bob Butler.
No, there was the running back. That's right. But he said that he heard things on the football field that were unprintable. And he was saying this like 30, 40 years later, right? But anyway, while Pradas was that's GideonSmith. While Pradas was here, there was a racial incident where the white waitresses were using racial slurs, and the black men said, "We want them fired, and if you don't fire them, we all quit." Well, there was a whole group of them. Only 3 ended up quitting, and he ended up one of them. And so he ended up in Chicago, and then started working with the Chicago Defender, which at the time was one of the leading African-American newspapers in the country.
Yes. And then after that, while in Chicago, then he started working for the Associated Negro Press, and he was many articles. Pradas is probably one of the most celebrated of these Hampton Ferris students, where his newspaper articles are everywhere. In 1947, he became the first African American admitted to the U.S. Congress, House, and Senate press galleries. So one of the things that Dr. Pickman likes to say is that what else happened in 1947 as far as African American history? Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson. So these are the thing on that date or on this year. He's one of the names that are mentioned. Yeah. He worked for the Pittsburgh Courier for most of his life, or most of his professional life, where he was the executive editor, and he had a long-running column called The Horizon. And he was the first, or he started the first magazine called The Light. It was like the first African-American news and entertainment magazine, about 20 or 30 or so years before Ebony and Jet started. He was one of the first starters of that kind of magazine.
And there's a couple things about him people just don't make a big deal out of. Everybody's heard of Albany magazine? Anybody heard of Albany? He did it 30 years before they did it. And the other part about him, which Frank, I'm sorry I cut him off, he didn't get to, along with Belfort Lawson, this is one of those people that came here who had the most to do with historical figures. And so we have photographs, and I don't know, we just lost our image here. Okay. Where they had real meaningful relationships with the people that you're reading about in your history books.
Right. And when he worked for the Courier as the executive editor, the Courier was the most popular African-American newspaper in the whole country. So his voice, he was one of the leading voices in civil rights long before the quote-unquote civil rights movement started. Yeah. And a lot of these guys were that. They were the fathers and the foundation of the civil rights movement in the United States. Yeah. This is a really interesting quote about Mr. Percival Pradas' time here at Ferris.
Yeah, this is actually from him. We found he was writing a book when he died. And I think he was losing it a little bit because it's really like 2 or 3 different books, and they're all like they're all like independent books, but they're not. There's passages that's the same. We don't know what's going on, but we were able to find some good stuff in there. And so in one of the books we read, Ferris Institute was really great. It was an acknowledged cram school. Everyone worked hard, including the teachers. If you needed extra tutoring, the teachers gave it to you without extra cost. Our saint, of course, was Woodridge N. Ferris, the white-haired founder of the school who later became governor of Michigan.
Yeah. Okay. And then this one, he really talks about his times here. And if you can read this here, during that period from 1916 to 1917, he covered 2 years of French. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I mean, 2 years of French, 2 years of Latin, algebra, plane geometry, trigonometry, rhetoric. I mean, man, this is incredible. But those 2 years of French is what got him the commission while he was in the military, because he could speak French, write French, read French, and someone else saw that, and then they promoted him. Yeah. But he talks here fondly about the teachers here, about Masslink, the vice president who taught the college preparatory department, Mr. Carlisle, regarded as the biggest little man in the state, and Mr. St. Peter, who, it was reputed, could do anything with electricity and carry tables for mathematics on his head, or in his head. These men made me feel like I had a chance in life. So did many of the students. All
right. Do you see this? This is what we're saying. This is the Ferris you're inheriting. This is, and by the way, Percival Pradas was not ambivalent in his life, in his fight against racism. You read his writings, some of it's by any standards, radical. I mean, he was a strong, staunch opponent of racism. So if he would have been experiencing that here, he would have been saying it. And what he said was, these men made me feel like I had a chance in life. He didn't say all, he says, but so did many of the students. That's his testimony. That's not an advertisement. That's not from a brochure. This was from an unpublished biography that he did not get to publish before he died. So this is like my favorite of the people. I guess I shouldn't have favorites. But Belfort Lawson came here. And that 1920s picture that we're going to show you at some point, or we're going to It should be all over this campus because it has men in it, it has women in it, whites, blacks. It's got all these people, and they're mixed in all together. The 1920s, where that was not what was going on in the rest of America. And right down, you can't see the picture, but if you're in my brain, he's right there in the picture, and he looks so young. He's just this little boy, right? He's like looking reserved. You don't know that 18 years later, he's going to stand before the United States Supreme Court and become the first African American to win a case before the United States Supreme Court, a case that allowed actually anyone to picket.
Anyone, and that's
Anyone.
anyone. So that confirmed and gave the right and solidified it in this Constitution that
Yeah.
you can pick it. You have that right.
Yeah, the right to picket. And it's like, it drives me mad. It's like, when I travel and I say, so who was the first African American to argue and win a case before the United States Supreme Court? Everybody says Thurgood Marshall. Now, Thurgood Marshall was in the audience on that day. And Franklin, between you and I don't think he ever forgave Belfort Lawson for being in the audience and not at the big table, because later on there's going to be later on he undercut Belfort Lawson and stole several cases that are significant in our history, right? And so anyway, long story short, he was on the Michigan. Now, we talked to his son. We discovered that his father never got on the football field at the University of Michigan. He was also a football player. He never was allowed to play because Coach Yost wasn't going to let him play. In scrimmages, he was wonderful. We have newspapers. We have, 12?
At least 12 or 13
Yeah.
newspapers at the University of Michigan. They would report on the practices and scrimmages, and he, every single time, was the most dominant player on the field. So he was dominating the 1923, 1924 Michigan team who won the national championship. He's dominating them in practice, but they didn't allow him to play because he was black.
Yeah. But what we were able to tell his son was this, and we didn't know this, and this was, of all the things, Franklin found a lot of stuff. He didn't find it all, but Franklin found, I'm just teasing you. But here's the coolest one of the pieces that he found. He went digging in Hope College newspapers, and found out that there was a paragraph. Well, Hope has smashed us in football one year, but they talked about this Negro player and what an outstanding player was. And you start looking, realize he actually had a pretty good football career at Ferris. Yeah. And maybe in the telling of his football to his son, that all got mixed in together.
Well, and I think he probably had maybe he had a lot of resentment that he wasn't allowed to play. I mean, he knew if you're dominating a team that wins a national championship every day in practice, and you can't play, I'd be bitter. Yeah. So he might have had some things I don't want to talk about.
Well, and Michigan does some stuff too. One is they have an official picture. That's 1923 championship team, which was a great team for its era. They have an official picture, and it doesn't have them in it. And then they have a picture in the athletic facility that has them in it.
Right.
And so he did get a varsity letter as a reserve, what we used to call descriptively a scrub, but it just meant a reserve. So that last part is significant, and that is he not only was the 16th president of the Alpha Phi Alpha, much of his life was defined as an Alpha. And keep in mind that the Alphas were not just a fraternal organization, they were one of this country's first civil rights organizations. And so a lot of the civil rights cases, that fraternity ended up not just supporting them financially, but they supplied the lawyers. And most of the prominent African Americans in that period were members of the Alphas, and most of those guys who came here who joined fraternities were Alphas.
Yeah, and Alphas, you have Du Bois was an Alpha. We have a picture with Lawson with Du Bois sitting next to him at an Alpha meeting. Martin Luther King was an Alpha. Mike can tell you. He can tell you a whole list of them. But yeah. So Belfort Lawson in his career, not only is his attorney career, he had the second case here, this is the first one, the New Negro Alliance versus Sanitary Grocery in 1938. But the second case was Henderson versus United States. And he was assisted on that case by Thurgood Marshall. And that was the case to, you can explain that one.
Well, just think about it. If segregation varied from state to state. So if you're in one state, and you got to drive through another state, what does that mean? Well, Southern Railway decided we ain't going to play that game. We're just going to set up a black table, and it's going to be a small table in the restaurant part. But so there'll be like multiple white tables, and then there'll be this single black table. But if there's no blacks, the whites can have that table too. And so this guy Henderson, who by the way worked for the federal government as a person who looked for discrimination, actually was in this case looking for a sandwich and could never find a seat. They told him what you could eat with one of the porters or the porter station or whatever. Anyway, the case made it. He took it to the Supreme Court and basically started the process of eliminating, or helped along, didn't start, helped along the process of eliminating segregation in public accommodations.
Yeah.
It's an important case.
And these were 2 chips against the,
Yeah.
the wall of segregation.
Yeah, I think you could make this argument that it was certainly easier for JFK to become president once he became associated / friends with Belfort Lawson. Lawson not only became his advisor, but he became his advisor at a time when black people were not going to vote for JFK.
And
JFK had voted.
He provided the forums. He provided the audiences for JFK to speak to African American audiences and present his issues and present his platform.
And keep in mind that Kennedy had voted against an earlier civil rights bill, and a lot of most black people didn't know who he was, and the ones who did know him didn't like him because he had voted against that. And Marjorie Lawson and Belfort Lawson basically guided his, she was one of the first African-American women to be a strategist. I think she had the state of West Virginia, and he was just an advisor on the overall campaign.
So the next guy that we talk about is Russell Dixon, and Russell Dixon is probably another great example of helping others rise. So Russell Dixon came here to the Ferris Institute from 1920 to 1923, and it was one of the most interesting things about him is that Mr. Ferris actually took him under as like a mentee, yeah. and they had a mentor-mentee relationship. Mr. Ferris encouraged him to go to Northwestern to further his education. He was the first African American to get an advanced dental degree in the United States, and he got that from Northwestern. He went on to become the dean of dentistry at Howard University, which trained more than half of African American dentists in the country. So again, the program is there helping people rise, helping people have an opportunity.
Yep. Keep going.
Do you have anything else?
No, go ahead. That's all right.
Okay.
So, as Franklin was saying, that quote is just, this was someone writing later about the relationship and the friendship and encouragement. It wasn't just that. Woodbridge Ferris used his influence to get African Americans into Northwestern. I'm assuming he also did it into Michigan State and Michigan. But we know in the case of Northwestern that I don't know what that connection is. If somebody, you went to Northwestern. If someone can figure out what that relationship was, that would be pretty cool. But we know that Northwestern was one of the early institutions which offered advanced education for African Americans in dentistry. And we know that more than a handful of those came from here in Hampton.
And dentistry is an important, particularly at the time, is an important vocation to have as an African American because you're independent.
Right.
You own your own business. You have your own wealth. You're not dependent on anybody. And it was a need in the community. Yeah. I mean, a lot of white dentists aren't seeing African Americans. Right. So it was, the dentist was at this time probably one of the most influential people in the entire community.
And a lot of them were civil rights advocates, again, because they had the freedom to be that. Next.
Percy Fitzgerald, he's interesting. He's also a dentist, and he went to Howard as well with Russell Dixon, and he was a professor there. But one of his claim to fame that we found interesting is prior to coming to Ferris, he was in World War I, and he was part of the 369th Infantry, which is the Harlem Hellfighters, which is it was a nickname given to them by the Germans for their ferocity and their unwillingness to surrender. And this group was celebrated when they came back from the war in New York City. There was a grand parade down the streets of New York, and he was a part of this group. He was a part of the fighting group of World War I.
Yeah, we didn't mention this about Dixon, but if you go to Howard University today and you go to their dental school, the name of the dentist school is the Russell E. Dixon.
Russell A. Dixon.
Russell A. Dixon. That's the name of the building that they're in. One of the things we've noticed, and that reminded me because there's that Percy Fitzgerald Award here, with a lot of these, I mean more than a few, other universities have named buildings after them, have named scholarships after them, have named any number of things after them, and we haven't. And to that extent, I'm not sure Hampton has. Huh? Go ahead.
Yeah, so as a Harlem Hellfighter, I mean, he was a hero. He's a war hero. And he came to Ferris. The next guy is William Gibson. William Gibson also followed the path, or similar path as Percival Pradas, where he became a journalist. He was mainly focused on sports journalism, and at a time for the Baltimore Afro-American, which was the second or third most popular African-American newspaper in the country, and he was the executive editor of that as well. He was also later on was the executive editor of Ebony and Jet magazines and Tan magazines. Yeah. So,
well, you didn't say it, so
right.
He went to Ohio State too. So
let's
forget it.
All
right, keep going. So we're going to run through some of these. Good, and we're going to talk about our portrait in the middle. So, Franklin, just do if you could do a little.
Yeah, so these are just samples of some of these other guys that came here, and we know a little bit some about these guys' stories. We talk about them a little bit expanded in the book, but some of them are just little bullet points. Yeah. You know, William Howard, he was here after Ferris. He went to the University of Michigan and was a dentist for years. Again, the role of a dentist in the African American community is very significant. We also found this at Ferris in 1914, 1915. These two gentlemen right here. This is James Duncan from Montgomery, Alabama, and that's John Swinnerton Smith. I can't remember where he's from. But anyways, both of those guys went to Hampton. They played football at Hampton, but they came here and they played football and basketball at the Ferris Institute. Now this picture is from 1915, which is going to be very rare to find it anywhere. You have two African Americans with 4 white Americans playing basketball. Now basketball, at this time, there was probably known in the whole country, maybe 19 African Americans who had played on an all-white basketball team. And here at the Ferris Institute, you have 2 playing at the same time.
Well, and part of that had to do with the intimacy of sweating on each other. I actually had a quote from whoever was president of Notre Dame, like in the 1930s or 40s, where he's trying to grapple with this idea that in football, your body sweat is not really the same way in basketball. I played football and basketball. I quit playing basketball because I kept hurting myself on the rim. But and Franklin quit playing football because he injured his leg. So now we just talk about those things. But here's another thing, and I don't want to get into this too much, but Hampton was also a place for Native Americans. You know, the whole Native American story about how they came, Hampton were educating them. And so we had a little bit of a dispute but you can't tell people's ethnicity from photographs, anyway.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
This is another example, though, I think, of Mr. Ferris making a conscious decision to show the world that we're different. This is in the yearbook. This is, and it was in some of the publications that they had at the time.
Yeah, and I told Franklin, I know I would dominate these dudes and he's like, yeah, but the ball doesn't bounce.
And you'd be called for traveling every time.
And they won't let me do a jump step, and that's traveling, whatever. Go ahead.
So we have other guys. Dr. James Wells, at a time, in 1942, he was part of the who's who of colored America. And he was another dentist. Paul Singleton was a professor of biology at Virginia State University, had a distinguished career there as a professor. Maceo Clark, this is who this painting from Cary is of. He attended Ferris. He was in the military as well. When he went to Hampton, after he left Ferris, he went to Howard. He went to Howard. He played on the Howard baseball team, and he played for the Washington Potomacs, the Negro League baseball team at the same time, which is interesting. That's never allowed nowadays. Yeah. But he was a star baseball player, but he decided to focus on becoming a physician. And here again, he was an advocate in his town in Dayton, Ohio. He was the NAACP president.
Well, and that was a big deal, the last one, about him serving on the Board of Regents, too. Okay, go ahead.
So that's one of the paintings. We're trying to get more of these guys, just paintings of these individuals. Other guys, Lawrence Paxton was the first African-American to serve on the Roanoke School Board, Roanoke, Virginia. He was a dentist. Hannibal Clark, his brother was Maceo Clark. There's a scholarship named after him at Marshall University.
So this case right here, this is the other one we're getting painted right now. And I would say this made national news. At least it made the national black newspapers. Maceo Santa Cruz was a dentist, and he was leaving his office, and he saw two young men. I think one was 18 and one was 20 or 21 or something. But they were this is my interpretation based on newspaper accounts, verbally assaulting and groping. That's the best I can interpret from the newspaper accounts, because they didn't use language the same way. Two young African American girls, two teenage. I think one of them was.
One was like 14.
14
one
or
was
something,
like
yeah.
15.
And the girls were screaming and everything. And so he came out of his office and told them to stop. And then they, of course, said what you would imagine they would say. So he walked across the street. In those days, people didn't all have telephones. They had public phones. And so if you had a quarter, dime, nickel, whatever it was, you went across and made a phone call. Well, he was walking across the street to get the phone. Then they grabbed him. One of them held him. The other one hit him, fell, hit his head on the curb, I think, and died of the results of of that. And this became like a really, interesting thing. And in the book, there's like just a little 2-page thing called the sad case of Maceo Santa Cruz, because he was living as well as you could as a black man in 1951. I mean, he was an educated dentist, well received, well respected. We read the mayor's account of his life and everything, and just living in that time, in that space. Also, here's the other thing. He went back to Virginia, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, he went to Pulaski, Virginia. Some of them went back, some of them never went back, stayed up here, worked. A number of them lived in Detroit or lived in some other places, but some of them did go back. But this case went really bad. So we wanted to, sort of, honor his presence with, so Carrie's working on a picture of him now.
And it's significant that Ferris offered the opportunities. I mean, these guys didn't have a chance to go to different places unless they went to Ferris. I mean, they had to get certain schooling, certain coursework in order to go to Northwestern or University of Michigan or Michigan State.
Or Howard, eventually
Howard.
going to Howard, yeah.
Nathan Miller, he's an interesting man. I'm sure many of you heard of what year was it? Prince George County, man, I don't have the year in there. When the Prince George County school system shut down in the 50s because of segregation, they would not integrate. So they, instead of forced integration, they said we're just shut down the schools. So they shut down schools for 5 years. So people who had means, which normally at that time are white people, they would move their students or their kids to other schools. But the communities, the Prince George black students had nowhere to go to school. So Dr. Miller opened up his office practice to where they had meetings there, but they also held classes. So here he is as an advocate, helping others rise in his own community, using his building, his office building that he independently owned, that he could offer classes and give the students in the area a chance to be educated. And he was also later on became the first African American to be on the school board of the Prince Edward School Board.
Yeah.
I said Prince George? Yeah.
Yeah.
Leo Roy, another Ferris Hampton guy, he was part of the Phelps Stokes Fund, which was a philanthropy organization that was dedicated to helping poor whites, poor blacks, and poor Native Americans to be educated. He was the main secretary for the organization. Out of the Phelps Stokes Fund, if you see here this third bullet, the United Negro College Fund started, the Booker T. Washington Agricultural Industrial Institute of Liberia started, and the American Indian College Fund started. So Leo Roy was the accountant and the main secretary for the organization. and also Ferris men. This is a picture, we're talking about Leonard McLeod, who came to Ferris. Before he was at Ferris, he was at the Hampton. He was the head of the ROTC. Prior to that, he was at the 17th Provisional Training Regiment in Fort Des Moines, Iowa, which was the first African-American officer training program in the United States. So there was a handful, or more than a handful, about 1,700 African-Americans that were commissioned in World War I, and Mr. McLeod, or Lieutenant McLeod, was one of those. After leaving Ferris, he came to Hampton, or after leaving Hampton, he came to Ferris. And so this is a picture that's in the yearbook, and it was in some of the advertisements. And if you can see here, you know, this is the Ferris ROTC, and there's some identifiably African Americans in 1920 in this picture. This one over here, man, this button's not working. This is Belfort Lawson right there. There's Maceo Santa Cruz right here. There's Maceo Clark, the second up there, or third one. But again, this is an instance, I think, where Mr. Ferris is making a conscious decision to show this place is different than anywhere else in the country. This is 1920. I don't think you would see this anywhere else in the country in 1920, a picture like this.
Well, especially not given the race riots that just had swept the nation
The year
before, where you basically had in the United States what amounted to a race war. And I don't use that term lightly. It approximated a race war. And you had African Americans being lynched still in their uniforms and stuff. And so here, you know, it's a little different. I'm not trying to make it sound like it was paradise. There were some problems, but.
Yeah, there was opportunities.
Yeah.
There's plenty of other students. I mean, some of these guys, their stories will be in the book, just little brief snippets of their stories. So, but we're just trying to show you that there was more than just these few. I mean, there's just dozens of guys. Oops.
Yeah, get to that next quote. So,
yeah, so Mr. Ferris had to have some kind of relationship with Hampton. We haven't figured out if there was any documented relationship that he had with the Hampton Institute, but we do know that he did speak at one of his last public speeches that we know of was here at Hampton. He spoke at their Founders Day.
yeah, he died. He went down there, and based on what he said, and that was one of the few Ferris that we could find, so what are the odds? We find that one, and it just is reporting on his trip to Hampton, and he gets down there, and he's just blown away. I think it was his first time. I think his relationship with Hampton had been basically a relationship with Booker T. Washington and all those students. And so he goes down there, and he even has a little bit, you know, because at the time the idea was black people aren't very good at mechanical stuff. And there's a little bit of quote where he got down and he was like, they're good at mechanical stuff too. They're good at everything. So it was like even that, right? But he was well treated, and he was met at the bus station, not bus station.
Train station.
He was met at the trailway. He was met at the train station by one of the Beecher, one of the
Stoves.
I forget which one it was.
Harry Beecher, I think it was.
Was it Harry Beecher?
Or Henry.
It was one of them. He was met with him. So he made mention of that, and then he gave a talk, and then he came back, and I think he died like a month later or so. Yeah.
Another thing about Mr. Ferris, which is not necessarily related to Hampton, but during this time, kind of while the Hampton thing was going on, in 1914, as governor of Michigan, he commissioned a number of delegates to celebrate the African-American accomplishments from 50 years after emancipation for the Lincoln Jubilee, which was going to be held in 1915 in Chicago. This is the Michigan booth, a picture of that. And there's a picture of Elijah McCoy. He's actually there, then right above his picture. He's a Michigan guy.
Yeah, so at first I was funny because I was like, I don't think that's the real McCoy. I think that's a dummy, right? Because it looks like a little bit of a, what do you call it? A
mannequin.
A mannequin, right? So it's not the real McCoy. But we found out it was. How many times can I milk that? Also, Mr. Ferris spoke during Michigan Day and did a good job. Keep in mind, too, 1915 was not a great year for African Americans. Booker T. Washington died. The movie The Birth of a Nation came out, which popularized every filthy stereotype of black people you could think of. It was a year of lots of lynchings and the like. And, by the way, about The Birth of a Nation, we have a quote where he basically says he wants his 2 hours back, that it was what you use the term, damnable. And he didn't curse. He didn't drink, ever. And he didn't curse. But that's close to cursing, isn't it? He says that was a damnable movie, that it insulted both colored and white, that it inflamed people. And that was a powerful condemnation of the first blockbuster movie in the history of the United States. It was $2 at the time. That's $50 a ticket in today's money. And it was a big grossing movie, and he came out and condemned it. So again, him going there in 1915, giving a talk, him supporting this effort, and the book that they produced, the Michigan Manual, by the way, it's on the internet, that's a famous now historical piece, because it marks a point in time in the history of Michigan for black people.
Right. And he commissioned it, so he used his power as the governor to make sure that these stories will be told.
So we should probably get to some, I don't know how much more we got, but that's one we see all the time. I actually just found a better one than that, but that quote actually comes out of the Michigan Manual of Freeman's Press. We have no color line, no age limit, no education requirements for admissions.
Well, this is right after he tells a story about the
girl
student.
that came. Yeah. Well, we've told them that story before.
Oops. More stories. One of the things that we did discover through here is that there's a lot of Spanish-speaking students that attended the Ferris Institute in these early years, and we don't know much about their stories at all. So there's opportunities to study these. I mean, you have Luis Lopez from Ecuador, and Miss Lizzie Fields, I don't know if you're here this morning, her story was kind of read, but was read this morning about how she came here in between 1916 and 1920 to take summer classes. She's probably, finding African-American women has been hard, but she's one of the first that we have been able to confirm was here. Again, more Spanish-speaking students, and this is just a couple instances that I'm just showing. These are some African-American women that we did find later on, but they weren't, many of them weren't from Hampton. None of them were from Hampton that we could determine.
I tell you what, whoever writes that book on the women, you're gonna have a hard time, because names change, when you get married and stuff, and then it's just hard. I mean, we really, really are trying, and had hoped to find some women in that group of Hampton students. So we have not been to Hampton yet. We've made some overtures to them. Now that we have a solid manuscript, which is good enough on its own, I think, with some editing, I think we can now supplement it with different things. So Hampton has a museum. I don't know what's in it. I think it's just a general theme, a sort of African-American museum. But maybe we go down there and there's a bunch of pictures and stuff we could use. Maybe they give us, free, some license to do that. We certainly want to let them know. And so I think that if we can slow the bus a little bit, although I'm ready for this to be over, that we could get down there this spring and have a trip that's productive. That's the thing that we want to have happen. So a couple things. We're doing one of these today with the campus-wise. We've talked to a few. Like I said, Franklin's reached out to the Hampton people. He's still reaching out to them. He's talked about the international. I want to add something to this piece right here. This is the part I'm interested in, implementing the story into the Ferris history narrative. Maybe people are just waiting for a book to come out, but when I'm listening to Ferris people tell the story, they're still telling the same old story. They're not, and I'll say this again, if you're telling a story of Woodridge Ferris and Helen Ferris, but we don't know as much about her because, as Dave says, not that much was written about her. She wasn't the one being quoted and whatever else. But we notice with like Russell Dixon and some of them, they were friends of the family. That would include her, right? I mean, and maybe even the son for that matter, or at the time if he was staying there. So, but I'm challenging us to stop telling just the same old stories. I mean, let's tell some of these new stories. We give awards all the time. I was giving someone a hard time here earlier, I think it was Franklin, about the buttons, because they're Martin Luther King Day buttons. Well, that's pretty cool. But I'd love to see a Belfort Lawson button and a Percival Pradas button and all these people. And, you know, we have the same 24 hours everybody else gets, right? So a lot of this research is done. I'm sending Franklin stuff 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And we're reading stuff, and it's been exhausting. I'm not trying to play the martyr. I'm simply saying it's hard work. But now that a lot of the groundwork has been done, we're challenging our campus to let's expand these stories. Now, we took a step in that direction with a magazine, with the Ferris magazine did a story. And Dave, you said you got a lot of good feedback on that. So that's one way of you know, kind of putting the news story out there. But we tell the Ferris story all the time. I think it's going to help when we finish the book and get it published. I also think it's going to help when we put up portraits around campus. Another thing about this is, as we've been looking for these African Americans, we found white students who came through Ferris who did wonderful, amazing things, and women who did wonderful. So we're keeping records of all those too. And so one of the things I hope that comes out in the next couple of years is that we create a space for some of these wonderful people who did wonderful things when they were here. Mentioned before, I mean, if GideonSmith and Nate Harris don't belong in our Athletic Hall of Fame, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, because they are historical figures. I mean, they are absolutely historical figures, as it were. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say one thing to add to what you were saying earlier, that if we don't tell these stories and of who Mr. Ferris is and these stories, we're not telling the complete story.
That's right.
And we're doing a disservice to the institute that holds his name, that we work at, that we're here for. So to tell the full story of Mr. Ferris is to tell the correct story of Mr. Ferris.
That's right.
And the Ferris
So
Institute.
I shared a quote with Dave. I hope he shares it with the campus today. You would not know that quote did not come from Martin Luther King. And it came from Woodridge Ferris. But no one, I worked at this school for years. The book starts out with this, the mural over in the College of Arts and Sciences. Because when I look at that mural, there is one identifiably black person in it. There are a couple of racially ambiguous people. There's one, and it's a guy with a sign that says, negotiate now. So if I didn't know any better, I would think that's the African-American experience represented at Ferris. I wouldn't know any of this. So we need new murals. Don't get me started on the mural downtown. That's a whole nother issue. But when we paint murals, that's just telling history in paint. And so we can tell new stories. All right, so let's got time for a couple questions? Yes, sir.
I'm interested about the Big Rapids Giants.
Yeah.
Why they came to Big Rapids, was it because of Woodridge Ferris?
I don't think that. Now, Franklin may have a slightly different turn on this, but let me try a stab at this. Big Rapids at one time was hopping. It was what do you call it, like a cross section?
Yeah, there was 5 different railroads that came through Big Rapids that had hubs here.
All right. And it was already a hot baseball area, as was West Michigan. So by the way, that's another long history of black baseball and white baseball, and integrated baseball in West Michigan. So it was simply the fact that a lot of people came through here. And what's the hotel we found? It was like some huge hotel, and people would work there and then play. I can't remember. It was like a huge hotel. We have pictures of it, whatever. So long story short, it was a highly trafficked area. And they came here, and it just caught on. In 1920, you had the first so-called, black World Series between the two leagues. And as Franklin was saying before that, it was just barnstorming teams, a little bit bingo long and all-stars, but more baseball than entertainment in that sense. And really, really great teams. They didn't have the capital to form leagues. So during that time, especially that early 1900s, Big Rapids was a player. Mm-hmm. The Colored World Championship of the world, mm-hmm. And they was, and Nate Harris went 3 for 5 in the game. Let's don't forget that. Yeah, that he went 3 for 5 in the game.
Yeah, but yeah, if you're trying to make a living as a baseball player, and that's what you do, you play everywhere, play anywhere, everywhere. But once they played here, the community loved them, and the community embraced them, and so that was why they stayed. The community pulled monies together and wanted to secure them for the rest of the year. So they did, and one of the main reasons was because the Big Rapids wanted to beat Greenville.
Yes, they wanted to beat Greenville had a great team. Any quick questions? Yes.
Talk about Ferris's passion here at Ferris.
Yeah.
As he became governor, how did it transform into politics?
That's great. Well, one thing he told you, Franklin was telling you that, he used his position. Franklin really doesn't like the word bully pulpit because of the word bully, but he used it as a vehicle to sort of address some racial stuff and to celebrate African American. And that's partly how we get the Michigan Day at the Jubilee. The Jubilee. But he also used it, for example, of his public voice, again, attacking the movie Birth of a Nation, that kind of thing. Also, he hired some people, and the group that put together he put together a team of people to commission.
Which means that they would have been state employees.
The state employees.
At that
And he
time.
had advisors who were African American. So, yeah, so I would, that's what he did. Yes.
What kind of backlash or hate did Mr. Ferris receive after helping out so many African Americans?
That is a great question. One of the things that I've noticed is, other than the coal strike, where he sent in some troops, the copper strike, that would be different. Other than the copper strike, where he sent in some troops, we could not, now we found a couple things he did that we didn't like that much, but they were that many. But we did not find, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of newspapers, most people did not have an unkind thing to say about him. It was actually to the point where I was starting to get nervous about that, because he was just selling big time, small, big newspaper, small newspaper, magazines, whatever. There was this general consensus, especially as he got older, that he was this wise, caring man who loved the people of Michigan. And if you think about it, it wasn't just the Republican infighting that got him elected. It was also his personal popularity, because his numbers compared to the other Democrats were always better. So it was he was just popular. So we just didn't find a lot of that at all. Even though he would stand up in front of the quotes that he would talk about race and about how we need to avoid racism and all this other stuff. I mean, was not the common thing to say at the time. We have no evidence of people saying something contradictory to him or criticizing him for saying it. Maybe one, yes.
I find all this stuff very interesting. I'm trying to wrap my head around what happened at Ferris. How much of your research was happening at Ferris 40s, 50s, and 60s?
Yeah.
You get a situation that ends up with the racial turmoil. In
Yeah,
1960s.
that's a great question, and I'll actually move your question up a little bit, which is, why did it stop? And so we've been trying to figure that out, and we toyed with some things. I think one, Hampton was becoming a university, so that was one. So they didn't need us anymore. I'm just saying. Secondly, the Great Depression, right? So people can't do some of the things they were doing, whatever. Third, I don't know quite how to say this, but when Massillink died, and again, we I don't know, I think we're on the same page, I don't know. I think a lot of Woodbridge's sort of message for Ferris died when Massillink died. So Massillink was, he himself, he has a wonderful career. I would not insult him by referring to him as a junior Woodbridge, but they were alike in a lot of ways. You can tell they were friends. He admired Woodbridge. He ran Ferris when Woodbridge was off being governor and then later senator and all this other stuff. I truly believe if Massillink had lived longer, that this would have continued. I think when Massillink dies, then it's like the school is in chaos.
Because that's 1929.
That's
So
1920.
You have in the mid-20s, you have the Klan, which
Yeah.
is just blowing up. So you do have that in pockets in this area. Then you have Woodbridge Ferris dying, and you have Massillink dying. You have the Great Depression starting. So there's just a lot of variables that just totally changed the landscape of this whole area.
So I think it was mostly them dying. What time we got, by the way? I gotta get to a meeting here pretty soon. But Franklin will stay and keep doing this with you. So I think that was
We can be done.
mostly it. I think they were directionless. But it's a fairly amazing thing that you had this school that Woodridge envisioned and was trying to live out. And I told you the dormitory thing, right? That we believe, the first dormitory here was built for black students because they couldn't find people in the surrounding area wouldn't let them live in their houses, and there were no real dorms. And Woodridge bought a building, converted, it was small, only 9 people could stay in it, and it burned down. And that's how we found out about it in a newspaper of it burning down. And from everything we can tell, this was after he was financially invested in the school in the same way. So he basically bought it out of his own pocket and he donated it to the school. All right, that's a level of commitment, all right? I mean, that's far ahead. Well, when he died, so he died in 1928. 40 years later, you have white professors and students surrounding black students in a dormitory talking about kill all the niggas. You got folks throwing acid on, you got all kind of craziness going on in 40 years. So both of those things are part of our history. But I would like to think that had Woodridge lived, well, he was in his 70s when he died, but had he of Massillon lived longer, we wouldn't have, who knows where we would have gotten. But the other part I would say to your question is this: it's amazing how quickly we forgot these stories. Because there was a time when everybody attending Ferris knew that black kids were here from Hampton because they were here with them. Hello? Right? I mean, they were seeing them on campus, right? I mean, everybody knew they were here. And there was a time when it was like celebrated to have people from Ecuador and Mexico and all these other places here, right? And then all of a sudden, it's like no one knew. And so when we tell this story to those African Americans who were protesting, including the leaders of the protests in 1968 or 69, when we tell this story to them, they didn't know this stuff. They were like, I don't want to say they thought we were lying, but it's like if people don't know a story, they think it can't be that big. Otherwise, they'd already know it. That we already know all the big stuff, right? So that's a great question. What we had thought to do at one point was to take this story from the 1900s to the 1960s. But I think that 1960, I think that's a book. That's its own book. That's its own story. All right, got time for one more. Well, can I ask you this? Did you learn anything today you didn't know? Do you feel, we don't work for advancement in marketing, okay? So I don't want to sound like I do when I say that doing this work has made us proud in an advancement in marketing kind of way to be a part of the school. We sound like we're out promoting the school when we do this, but I'm a sociologist. I'm always looking for the worst in people. That's what we do, all right? We are muckrakers. That's what we do. And we kept looking. And what we kept finding was, Massillon said one time in a speech that the black kids who had come, he had met black kids here at Michigan State who had endured bitter prejudice, but they were accomplishing great things nevertheless. So we know that it was not perfect here. We know that here, that there were blackface plays put on, and we documented 3 of them. We know that the homecoming parade, a couple times, I actually saw film of one of those from like the 60s or 70s, but even in the early, or especially the early days, we saw some plays. As Franklin mentioned, there was a Klan in this area. But I think most of their attention was focused on the Roman Catholics, to be honest with you, the local Catholic community. But, it wasn't perfect here, but there was opportunity here. So, do you have any last comment?
The last thing I was going to say is that this area also, and I don't want to lose sight of it, there's also a lot of African Americans in the area, in Remus, Mecosta, Idlewild, Baldwin. And so you have a situation where it's kind of fertile ground, where you could have a situation like this. So with Mr. Ferris's values and what he was trying to do, I think a lot of the community embraced it because that was part of the fabric of this area at the time.
So again, if we come here 2 years from now, we're just going to add stuff. One first things in the book is this may not be the whole story. and here's the reason to think that. We found four African Americans here before the first black was here. In other words, the person we've been telling for years, this is the first one. We found 4 before that person, all right? We found them because they were in newspapers or some weird, is it possible somebody was here that didn't make the newspaper? Does you get where I'm going? Those 4 that we mentioned all became historical figures, right? You know, the Negro League baseball and a big-time business person, all this other stuff. Isn't it possible that somebody came here and became a gardener or something? I mean, didn't do something life said. So there's other stories to tell, and we'll keep telling them. Thank you. And by the way, give a hand to Franklin. And you know why you're giving him a hand? Because this got started. This man's not a historian. He's like I am, right? He's just a guy walking through the past, paying attention, reading other people's history. In other words, their interpretation of the past. All I asked him to do was to go find me a picture of GideonSmith. That's how this all got started, because I wanted to do a portrait of GideonSmith. He comes back with a portrait with 2 or 3 black people, and I'm like, who are those black people? And from that has led to nothing but drudgery and pain and all this other stuff as we kept digging, and then you become a little bit of a detective. And so if, one of the things that I hope comes out of this is also that a person, he's not an archivist, he's not a historian. He's a historian in the same sense that J.A. Rogers is a historian. Just someone who wants to find out what happened. Not in history, in the past, what actually happened. And so that's what started us on this journey. So, I don't know, that's a good setup for you?
I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
you
you.
all. Thank you all.
Thanks, brother.